The stone was new. That was the first thing Edmund noticed, before the cold reached him, before the churchyard smell of wet yew and turned earth settled in his chest. The stone was too white, too clean, for the Somerset autumn light, and the letters cut into it had not yet weathered to the gray softness of the older graves around it. Someone had commissioned it recently. Someone had paid for good quality work and not stinted on the depth of the carving. He read the name a second time. Edmund James Carlyle, it said. Baron Ashwick. Born 1784. Died at sea 1817. Edmund pressed one hand to the yew tree at his left. The bark was rough against his palm and real. In a way, the stone did not feel he had been in the Red Sea in 1817. He had nearly died there, in fact, of a fever that took 3 men in his company. But he had not died. And he had not been at sea. And he had not been mourned because no one in Somerset had been informed he was unwell. He had simply continued. He had recovered, and continued, and spent another 2 years in Madras, and then sailed home on a perfectly ordinary merchant vessel in perfectly ordinary health, arriving at Bristol 4 days ago. He was 34 years old. He was standing in front of his own grave. The village had made no great ceremony of his return. He had ridden from Bristol alone, stopping at inns where no one recognized him, arriving at the boundary of the Ashwick estate to find the gates standing open, and a silence about the grounds that he had not expected. No steward had come out to meet him. The hall windows had their curtains in a particular arrangement he did not recognize, and the approach had felt in some way he could not articulate, as though it had been arranged to receive someone else. He had ridden to the village church on some instinct he could not have named, and here he stood, with his coat still dusty from the road, reading his own name on a headstone in the southeast corner of St. Cuthbert's churchyard. He became aware then of someone else in the churchyard. She was perhaps 20 paces away, crouched beside a smaller stone near the churchyard wall, pulling dead weeds from the base of it with careful hands. She had not heard him arrive, or, if she had not looked up. She wore a gray wool dress, plain, and her hair was pulled into a neat arrangement under a bonnet that had been quality once, and was now only careful. Her gloves were dark from soil. She worked with the focused economy of someone who did not permit herself to waste motion, and there was something in the set of her shoulders that suggested she had been doing this for a long time, not just this morning but across many mornings, and had made of it a kind of private discipline. Edmund watched her hands for a moment. He did not know why. She sat back on her heels, brushed soil from her gloves, and turned. She saw him at the same moment. He turned slightly toward her, and something moved across her face. Not fear, not surprise exactly, but a very particular stillness, the kind that comes over a person who has learned to take a moment before reacting because reactions have cost them something in the past. She did not rise. She looked at him, and then at the white stone 6 feet to his right, and then back at him. Her expression was entirely impossible to read. "You will forgive me," she said, her voice level and precise, "if I observe that you appear to be standing in a place which the village of Compton Ashwick had understood to be otherwise occupied." He blinked. He had not expected that. "I arrived in Bristol 4 days ago," he said. "I see," she said. She rose unhurried and dusted the remaining soil from her dress. "Then perhaps you had better come inside before anyone else sees you, my lord." "There is a great deal," she said, and her tone carried something between composure and careful warning, "that you do not know." Her name was Miss Cecily Marwood, and she had been keeping the graves of the Ashwick dead for 7 months. That was what she told him sitting across the vestry table from him in the cold little room behind the nave, while the rector was summoned and the sexton stood at the door and looked at Edmund as though he were either a ghost or a scandal, and could not yet determine which. She told it plainly, without apology, the way a person recites facts that have been organized out of necessity. She had arrived at Compton Ashwick as a companion to Edmund's mother, the Dowager Lady Ashwick, in the late spring, some weeks after news had come by the East India Company that Baron Ashwick had perished aboard a vessel called the Persistence in a storm off the Cape. She had a cup of cold tea in front of her that the rector's wife had brought, and she did not touch. Edmund noticed that she managed without it, as naturally as a person manages without something they have learned not to expect. Edmund had not been aboard the Persistence. He did not know the Persistence. He said as much. No, Miss Marwood agreed. Then who was? I do not know. The company sent a letter with a manifest. Your name was on it. She looked at him steadily across the table. Her eyes were a dark, quiet gray, and they did not flinch from his face. Your mother did not receive it well. He asked about his mother. Miss Marwood told him with the same levelness that the Dowager Lady Ashwick had suffered a severe decline after the news and had been confined to her room since July. She was attended by a physician from Taunton twice monthly. She was, Miss Marwood said, in no immediate danger of her life, but she had not left her rooms in 3 months, and she had not, in Miss Marwood's opinion, wished to. She is waiting, Miss Marwood said. For what? The gray eyes considered him. I had not thought to know the answer to that question, she said quietly. Until now. Edmund was aware in the cold vestry that he had been absent from England for 6 years, and that 6 years in a warm country had not prepared him for this churchyard, or this woman, or the sensation that something had shifted irrevocably in the last 20 minutes. She was watching him across the vestry table, and he understood, with some surprise, that she was not unsettled by this situation. She had catalogued it, as she seemed to catalogue most things, and she was waiting to see what useful shape it might take. He asked, because it was the next logical question, who had assumed the management of the estate? A pause. Small. Precise, your cousin, she said. Mr. Harlan Carlyle. The rector arrived at that moment, which was perhaps fortunate. Harlan Carlyle had arrived from London 6 weeks after the death notice, which Miss Marwood explained to Edmund in the carriage that evening as she accompanied him back to Ashwick Hall. Because no one else was available to explain it, and the rector had suggested it would be wise for someone who knew the current state of affairs to be present when Edmund arrived at his own door. She sat across from him in the dark carriage and told him what she knew in the same precise manner, and Edmund found himself watching her face in the brief passages of lamplight from the windows, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her hands folded in her lap, the quality of her attention when she was speaking. She chose her words carefully. She left nothing out and embellished nothing. Harlan had not taken formal possession of the title. That much was stated plainly. He had installed himself as a manager in a provisional capacity, citing uncertainty over whether Edmund's death could be officially confirmed, and had been engaged for the past 4 months in what he called a thorough review of the estate's affairs. He has been thorough, Edmund said. Yes, said Miss Marwood, and the word was careful in a way that told him more than most people would have said in an entire sentence. He asked her directly what she thought. She looked at him for a moment, this woman he had known for 4 hours, and then she said, I think, my lord, that a man who reviews an estate for 4 months without making a single repair to its tenant cottages, while commissioning a rather fine headstone and sending a notice to the County Gazette, has a particular kind of thoroughness in mind. Edmund sat with that for the rest of the ride. Ashwick Hall met him with lit windows and a sound of voices that was slightly too loud for a Tuesday evening. A carriage he did not recognize stood in the drive. He could hear music from the yellow drawing-room, and laughter, and the particular timbre of a dinner party that had reached its comfortable middle stage. Edmund sat in his own carriage and listened to the sounds of his house being used by someone else. How many? He said. He dines out often, Miss Marwood said. And he has invited neighbors. He has given the local families to understand that while the situation is legally imprecise, he expects it to resolve itself in the natural course. She paused. He has been, I believe, paying a particular attention to Miss Patience Vane. Edmund had not yet thought about Miss Patience Vane. He thought about her now. The Vane family held the neighboring property, and a marriage between Ashwick and Vane had been discussed in his parents' time and quietly set aside. And she was, if he recalled correctly, a composed and handsome young woman of good family who would be entirely sensible about an advantageous match with a man who would shortly inherit a barony. She does not know, Edmund said. No one knows, said Miss Marwood. Until this evening he stepped down from the carriage. He had expected a frozen tableau, or perhaps an outcry. What he got was something quieter, and in its way more telling. He opened the door to his own dining room, and 14 people turned to look at him, and for 3 full seconds nobody made a sound. The candles burned steadily. The wine sat in its glasses. Harlan at the head of the table. At Edmund's table in Edmund's chair, with Edmund's silver gleaming before him, went the color of old bone. Beside him, a woman in pale blue silk, composed and still, kept her composure with admirable precision and looked at Edmund with the expression of someone revising a great many assumptions very quickly. A colonel from the neighboring parish said, distinctly, "Good God!" "Good evening," Edmund said. "I find I am not dead after all." It was not elegant. It was, however, effective. The dinner broke apart in the way all such gatherings break apart, when the principal assumption on which they are founded is suddenly removed. Ladies withdrew to the drawing-room before they were asked. Gentlemen found urgent occasion to speak quietly to one another near the door. Harlan remained at the table, and Edmund gave him credit for that much at least, for he did not bolt. He sat with his hands flat on the cloth, and watched Edmund take the chair that had been left vacant at the far end, and they regarded each other across 14 empty place settings and a great many candles. "Cousin," Harlan said at last. "Harlan," Edmund said. He was, Edmund thought, a man who had arranged his life around a particular expectation, and who was presently engaged in a rapid and uncomfortable recalculation. He was not, in Edmund's assessment, a malicious person. He was a person who had believed a thing that appeared to be true, and had acted accordingly, and had perhaps acted slightly faster, and with slightly more confidence than strict probity required, but who was now confronted with evidence that the thing was not true, and found himself at a disadvantage. "There was a letter," Harlan said. "From the company I know," Edmund said. "I should like to see it." "Yes," said Harlan. "Yes, of course." He looked for a moment, very much less composed than he had looked at the head of the table. Edmund. He seemed to be choosing words with difficulty. "I hope you understand that I had every reason to believe." "I understand," Edmund said. "We will speak of it in the morning." He had spent 6 years in India learning that the most direct road through a thing was not always through it. He asked, that night, about Miss Marwood. He had not seen her since he entered the house. She had not come to dinner, which made obvious sense. She was a companion, and she had not been among the guests. And yet he noticed her absence in a way he found slightly difficult to account for, given that he had known her for less than a day. It sat with him through the remainder of that strange evening, a small, specific absence in the room he could not stop returning to. His valet, a local man named Simmons, who had stayed on through the months of uncertainty and seemed to regard Edmund's reappearance as the natural correction of a clerical error, told him what he knew. Miss Marwood was the daughter of a clergyman from Dorset, recently deceased. She had come to the dowager's household with good references and a quiet manner, and with, in Simmons' observation, very little in the way of personal possessions. She kept her own counsel. She was, in the valet's opinion, the reason the dowager had not been removed to Bath by Harlan, which he had attempted twice. "She refused to go?" Edmund asked. "Miss Marwood refused to permit it," Simmons said, and then corrected himself carefully. That is, she made it clear to Mr. Duber Carlyle that removing her ladyship from her own home against her expressed preference would occasion a conversation with the family solicitor, and she has some acquaintance with Mr. Hewell. Edmund considered this. "Has she?" "She is acquainted with a great many people," Simmons said somewhat admiringly. "For a woman who keeps to herself. She writes a good many letters." Edmund went to see his mother the next morning. The Dowager Lady Ashwick was in her sitting room, in a chair by the window, looking out at the park with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to those who have been waiting so long they have forgotten they are waiting. She wore black still, and the morning light was thin, and the room had that specific warmth of a fire tended faithfully by someone who had not let it go out in 7 months. He registered it, The fire had not gone out. Someone had made sure of it. She heard him come in, and she turned, and for a moment her face did absolutely nothing. Then it did several things at once, and Edmund crossed the room quickly and took her hands, and she held them for a long time without speaking. "You are cold," he said finally. "The fire went out this morning," she said. Her voice was thin but steady. "Miss Marwood was going to—" She stopped. Her eyes were very bright. "Edmund the stone. Who is in that stone?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But I intend to find out." He asked her carefully how she had been. She told him with more honesty than he had expected that she had not been well and that she was better since yesterday. Meaning since the news of his arrival had reached her, carried by Simmons, who had been told by the coachman who had driven the carriage from the church. She had, she said, known it would happen. She had not known when, and the waiting had been very long, but she had known. He asked how she had known. "Miss Marwood," she said simply. "She said someone should be waiting, in case." She did not say she believed you were alive. She said it seemed important to leave room for the possibility. His mother looked out the window at the park, which the autumn had taken down to its bones. The trees bare and the grass silvered, and the whole view a thing that had endured seasons and would endure more. She kept the grave for the same reason. She said she did not know whose it was, and she thought someone ought to treat it as real until they knew otherwise. Edmund sat with this for a moment. There was a quality in what his mother was describing that he did not yet have a word for. A woman had arrived in a house full of grief, unknown to its dead master, and deciding that the proper response was not to wait for instruction, but to do the necessary thing without it, not from sentiment, not from ambition, from some interior principle about what the situation required. He thought about the vestry, and the cup of cold tea she had not touched, and the way she had met his eyes across the table without performing anything. "She is," he said carefully, "a person of some quality." His mother turned from the window. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been waiting to be asked. "Yes," she said simply, "she is." He stayed with his mother for another hour. When he left, the fire was going strongly and she was reading a letter she had received from an old friend in Bath, and she had not glanced at the window once. The answer to the Headstone's mystery came from Bristol, via a letter Edmund sent to his company contacts on the second day. It took a week. The Persistence had indeed gone down in a storm off the Cape, and among its passengers had been a man named Edward Carlyle, no title, a merchant's son, distantly connected to a Carlyle family in Wiltshire, whose effects included a journal with a Somerset address, and whose name had been misread in the chaos of the manifest as Edmund Carlyle. The error had been compounded by a clerk in the Calcutta office who had seen the similarity and assumed. 6 months and 1 headstone later, the mistake stood in Somerset's county churchyard, waiting to be corrected. Edmund brought the letter to the vestry and showed it to the rector. He brought a copy to his solicitor in Taunton. He sent a third copy to the County Gazette with a brief statement. He did not tell Harlan until all 3 had been dispatched. He did not think this was unkind, precisely. He thought it was careful. What he had not accounted for, in his systematic dismantling of his own death, was the question of Miss Marwood. He saw her at odd intervals through the week. Once at the end of the upstairs corridor with a shawl over her arm and her attention entirely on a letter she was reading, who looked up as he passed and said "Good morning" with the air of a woman who had said good morning to him before and expected to say it again. Once in the kitchen passage where she was consulting with the cook about the dowager's appetite and did not see him at all. Once at the edge of the kitchen garden where she stood with her face turned up to the weak autumn sun and her eyes closed, and he stopped in the doorway because something about the image seemed private and he did not wish to disturb it. He found himself on that occasion standing in a doorway for considerably longer than was necessary. He was in the library when she came to find him on the 5th day she knocked, which he had not expected. He had assumed she would simply appear, as she seemed to appear at most places, already in possession of whatever information the moment required. She came in when he said to come, and she stood before the window with the gray October light behind her. And she said, I wish to ask you about my situation, my lord, before I heard of it from someone else. Edmund put down the estate ledger he had been trying to make sense of. Your situation. I came as companion to your mother, she said. With your return, and the change in household circumstances, I understand that my position will be reconsidered. She was watching him with that steady, gray gaze, and he had learned enough of her in a week to know that the question she was asking was not the question she meant. She meant something simpler. Was he going to send her away? She would not ask it directly. She was too composed for that, or too practiced at managing what she permitted herself to hope. My mother, Edmund said, has not left her room in 3 months, except when you persuaded her to take the air in the south garden last Tuesday. Miss Marwood's chin lifted slightly, which he was beginning to understand, was the version of surprise she allowed herself in company. My valet tells me, Edmund continued, that when my cousin attempted to move her to Bath, you consulted a solicitor. I consulted about the legal position. That is not quite the same thing. It produced the same result. She was quiet for a moment. Your mother did not wish to go. It seemed to me that her own home was the appropriate setting for her grief, and that removing her was Harlan's convenience, not hers. Yes, Edmund said. I thought that too when I heard of it. A small pause. Outside, the park was gray and still. The last of the season's leaves coming down in the cold, slow way of things that have held on as long as possible. He said because she had asked him a direct question, and she deserved one in return. I have no intention of reconsidering your position. My mother has need of you, and I am not a fool. She looked at him for a moment, and he saw something move through her face and settle. Something he could not fully read, but recognized as the careful setting down of something heavy. She had been carrying the uncertainty of her own situation for some time, he thought, and had not said so, and had not permitted it to alter her work. Thank you, she said simply. He should have let her go. She was already turning toward the door. He said, without having planned to say it. Miss Marwood, the grave. Did you place the flowers on it? She paused. Yes. Every week? Yes. He turned the question over. She had kept the grave of a man she had not known, a man whose death had arrived as a stranger's letter, because someone should, and because she was. He was beginning to understand the kind of person who did the necessary thing when no one else had thought of it. There was no audience for it. There was no reward for it. She had simply done it, in the same way she had written letters to solicitors, and kept fires burning and arranged for physicians, and stood between a grieving woman and a cousin's convenience. Why? He said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, very quietly, I did not know who he was when I arrived. Your mother spoke of you often. She spoke as though you might return at any moment, though she knew you could not, and I thought someone ought to. She stopped. She said carefully, someone ought to take the responsibility seriously. Edmund felt the library around him very precisely. The smell of old paper and the cold grate, and the October light against the window glass, and the particular quality of the silence between them. He said, he did not deserve the neglect. No, she said. He did not. She was gone before he thought of anything else to say. He stood at the window for some time after. Below, a groundskeeper was raking the last of the leaves from the south path, and the sound of the rake came up through the glass, regular and quiet, the sound of a household continuing to function. If you have stayed with this story until now, you already know what kind of woman she is. The rest is simply watching the world catch up. The matter of the headstone resolved itself as these things do, through the machinery of the county. The rector made an announcement. The solicitor filed his papers. The Gazette ran its correction on the Thursday. Harlan accepted the situation with what Edmund thought was genuinely good grace. Given the circumstances, for he had believed the thing, he had not fabricated it, and he left Ashwick at the end of the week with his dignity mostly intact, and the understanding between the cousins that no further review of the estate's affairs was required. Edmund found in going through the ledgers properly that Harlan had indeed been thorough, for several estate accounts had been reorganized in ways that would have benefited a new holder of the title. he wrote to the solicitor. He corrected the accounts. He said nothing further to Harlan because there was nothing to be gained by it, and because the man had at least kept the household staffed and the fires burning, which was not nothing. She wrote Edmund a brief letter. He replied with equal brevity and considerable respect, and the matter was closed. What was not closed, and what Edmund found himself returning to with a frequency that he recognized as disproportionate, was the question of Miss Marwood. Not the question of her position or her future, or any of the practical matters he might have categorized under household management. The other question, the one that arrived when he passed her in the corridor, and noticed, again, the precise way she moved through space, never crowding it, never wasteful, and felt something in his chest that was not entirely managerial in nature. He saw her every day. She was present at his mother's breakfast and at the small evening gatherings. His mother had begun to permit herself. Once Edmund's presence had confirmed that the world had not, after all, ended. She sat at the far end of the room with her sewing or her book, attentive without intruding, responsive without offering herself forward. She disagreed with the physician from Taunton once on a point of her ladyship's constitution, and she did it in terms so precise and so clearly sourced in observation rather than opinion that the physician had the grace to amend his recommendation. Edmund had been in the doorway and had not made himself known, and had stood there for some time after the physician left, in the corridor, thinking about the quality of her mind and about the particular way she tucked her chin when she was making a point she expected to be resisted. He was in Taunton when the incident with the letter occurred. He had been there 2 days meeting with the solicitor about the estate, and he came back to find his mother upset in a contained way that she was trying to conceal, and Miss Marwood in the morning room with the very particular stillness of someone managing a situation that has not yet been named. He asked his mother directly. She deflected, which told him it was worse than she wished him to know. He found Miss Marwood in the kitchen passage with a candle and a direction for the kitchen garden. "What happened?" he said. She looked at him. She considered briefly whether to abbreviate it. "There was a letter," she said, "from a Mrs. Hargrove who appears to be acquainted with the Carlisle connection. In Wiltshire." She had seen the Gazette correction, and she wrote to suggest. She stopped. She resumed more carefully. She wrote to suggest that your mother's melancholy had been sustained by the ministrations of a person of low position and questionable stability, and that a woman of stronger family might provide more appropriate support. Edmund took a slow breath. She further suggested, Miss Marwood said, and her voice remained entirely level, that a companion who had kept company with a dead man's grave for 7 months was exhibiting a dependence on your family that could only be explained by ambition, and that you should be advised of it before any permanent arrangements were made. She was speaking of herself in the third person, which was a method of managing something painful, and she was doing it without any particular inflection, as though she were reporting on a stranger. The candle in her hand was very steady. She was looking at him. Edmund said, "Is that what you were doing?" "No," she said simply. He believed her. He had not needed to ask. He had asked because he wanted her to know that she had been asked, and that his answer had not changed. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "is not a person whose opinion concerns me. It concerned your mother." "My mother," Edmund said, "will be spoken with." "You need not." She stopped. "Miss Marwood," his voice was level, "I am not unaware of what you have done for her, or for this household, in the months I was incorrectly dead. I do not require a third party's letter to instruct me in my own assessment." She was quiet. She was looking at him with that steady gray gaze, and he was close enough in the narrow passage to see the very slight change in her breathing, the careful rise of it. A strand of hair had come loose near her temple, and she had not attended to it, which told him she had been more shaken than she appeared. "There are people," she said after a moment, "who will say that a clergyman's daughter with no connections and no dowry has a particular interest in remaining useful to an unmarried baron." "Are there?" Edmund said, "Mrs. Baugh." Mrs. Hargrove was not the first. He turned this over. He was standing very near her, in the kitchen passage, with a candle between them and the smell of stone and cold and the season's last herbs from the garden outside. He had spent 6 years in a country where the social machinery worked differently, where a man's breeding mattered less in the daily workings of things than his capacity, and he had developed, in those years, a preference for the direct approach that he suspected was not entirely fashionable in Somerset. He said, "Then they will have to adjust their assessment." She looked at him. Something moved in her face. "My lord," she said, and her voice was careful, "I am not sure you understand what you are saying." "I understand precisely," he said. "I have been home 3 weeks. I have reorganized a dead man's estate, located the error in a company manifest, and persuaded my mother to eat regularly. I am reasonably certain I can assess my own meaning." He held her gaze. The candle between them made the passage very small and the light warm. Between them and her eyes were very dark in it. "The question, Miss Marwood, is whether you have any objection." A pause. Very long, very precise. "I have no objection," she said, with the same care she brought to everything. And then, almost without her permission, "None at all," she said, quietly. He moved the candle to the shelf beside him. He took her hand, the one not occupied with a direction for the kitchen garden, and held it between both of his for a moment, the way a person holds something they have been afraid would not be there. She did not pull away. She turned her hand in his and held it back. The rector returned the following Thursday to register the correction in the parish record. He noted in his careful hand that Edmund James Carlyle, Baron Ashwick, had not died at sea in 1817 and was in good health, and he drew a neat line through the entry his predecessor had made 7 months ago. He was the first person in the village to learn that the Baron had also applied for a marriage license, though he was not the last, and the news spread through Compton Ashwick, with the speed that such news always travels in a small parish, arriving at every breakfast table by Friday morning. There were those who said, in the measured way of such villages, that it was very sudden, and a number of those who said it were the same people who had found Miss Marwood quiet and unobtrusive, and had not particularly noticed her in 7 months of daily proximity. The village of Compton Ashwick, in Miss Marwood's own private assessment, had made rather more of her ambition than of her service, and rather less of the Baron's choice than of the convenience it offered her. She was to the village a fortunate clergyman's daughter. To the household, she was the woman who had kept the fires going when no one else had thought to manage the cold. She knew which of these she preferred. The white headstone remained in the churchyard for the rest of that autumn. Edmund arranged for it to be removed after Christmas, which the rector considered the appropriate interval. He walked past it most mornings on his way to the village, and he developed the habit of noting its condition, the lichen beginning to gather at the base, the letters softening as the stone aged into something less aggressively new, and of finding, more often than not, that Miss Cecily Marwood had been there before him, because the path past it was her usual path to the village and she had not changed her route, and she would be standing at the gate when he arrived, or walking ahead of him toward the lane, and they would fall into step beside each other without particular arrangement. The way 2 people fall into step, when they have been walking the same roads at the same hours, and have stopped pretending this is accidental. There was a morning in November, a gray morning with frost on the yew and their breath visible in the cold air, when she pointed to the base of the stone. Someone had placed snowdrops there. They were too early for the season, forced from a glass house somewhere, pale and deliberate, set in a small bunch at the stone's base, with the unpracticed arrangement of someone who had not done this sort of thing before. "Not me," she said. "No," he agreed. She looked at them for a moment. "Your mother was up before 6, was she?" They stood together in the cold, looking at the snowdrops, and Edmund put his hand over hers, where it rested on the iron gate. She did not pull away. She turned her hand in his, and held it, and the frost lay over everything, and the church bell began its slow count of the morning hour. And between one stroke and the next, she leaned her shoulder briefly against his, the lightest possible contact, a warmth against the cold, a small, deliberate certainty. He had come home to find his name on a stranger's stone, and he had found in the same day the woman who had kept it. By spring, Cecily Carlyle, Baroness Ashwick, could walk the path through St. Cuthbert's churchyard and see only the older stones, the ones that had been there long before she arrived, mossy and settled and belonging entirely to themselves. The white stone was gone by February. The grave had been rededicated, discreetly, to the merchant's son from Wiltshire, whose family had written a grateful letter and sent a small wreath, and had it properly marked with his right name. The snowdrops came back in March without anyone placing them, which the rector found theologically interesting and which Cecily found privately exact. She had her own key to the Ashwick side gate by then. She had her own chair by the morning-room fire, and her own shelf in the library, and her name on the visiting cards that the housekeeper ordered from Taunton in a neat stack, and she had the knowledge, settled and unhurried, inside her, that the man who stood at the breakfast table reading his correspondence, and who looked up when she came in and made room for her, always in whatever space he occupied, had come home from the other side of the world to a life that fit him, and she had helped make it so. She had not expected to be chosen. She had expected, in the quiet economy of her own expectations, to be useful, and then to be released, as companions were, when their usefulness ended. She had found, instead, that what she had done in the months of his absence had made her visible to the one person whose seeing mattered, and that his seeing was not gratitude, and not convenience, and not the assessment of a man choosing what was near to hand. It was specific. It was the regard of a man who had watched her refuse to budge and had decided, on that evidence, that he could rely on her judgment in things that mattered. She thought sometimes about the letter Mrs. Hargrove had sent, and about the long list of things she had been called, by various people, over the course of her life, called a clergyman's daughter, a companion, a woman of no connections, a woman of questionable stability, a woman keeping company with a dead man's grave, for reasons best explained by ambition. She did not precisely forgive these assessments. She simply found them less interesting than the alternatives. Edmund looked up from his letters. "The Taunton Road," he said, "is flooded at the South Bridge." "I know," she said. "Mrs. Hatch sent word this morning." He looked at her with that look she had learned to read, steady and particular, the look that meant he was glad she was in the room, and she took her place at the table beside him and poured the tea, and the morning opened around them, quiet and entirely their own.